After everything that had happened at Morgan Group, Rachel thought there was no secret left that could hurt her any more than she already had. But she was wrong. That night, Eleanor's personal lawyer unexpectedly arrived at the Morgan mansion. In his hands was an old wooden box, faded by time. No one spoke. Even Richard Morgan went still the moment he saw it. The lawyer slowly placed the box on the table and said, "Mrs. Eleanor instructed me to open this only when the Morgan family began collapsing under the weight of its own secrets." The atmosphere in the room instantly froze. Rachel frowned slightly. A deep sense of unease ran down her spine. If it were you, would you have the courage to open a box that could destroy everything you believed about your entire life? The lawyer slowly lifted the lid. Inside were old documents, carefully sealed for decades, and resting on top was an envelope with a single line written across it. For Rachel Morgan only. Rachel's heartbeat began to pound. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. And the moment her eyes landed on the first line of the DNA test results, the color drained completely from her face, because that truth would not only destroy the Morgan family, it would destroy who she believed she was. Rachel could barely hear anything in the room anymore. A loud ringing filled her ears. Her hands shook so violently, she could hardly hold the DNA test results. The sample does not match Richard Morgan. Just one short sentence, but enough to make her entire world collapse. Rachel stepped back, then another step, as if she had just been torn out of her own life. "That's impossible." Her voice cracked. Her tear-filled eyes slowly turned toward the man she had called Dad for 30 years. Richard Morgan said nothing, but for the first time, Rachel did not see coldness in his eyes. She saw pain. Her mother broke down sobbing. The room sank into the most terrifying silence it had ever known. If it were you, how would you feel discovering that the person you spent your entire life trying to earn love from was never even related to you by blood? Rachel let out a laugh, a broken laugh filled with pain. "So that's it? That's why you could never truly accept me?" Those words cut through everyone in the room. Daniel stood frozen, because for the first time, he realized Rachel had not only been betrayed, she had spent her entire life feeling rejected, without ever knowing the real reason why. Then her mother spoke through trembling tears. "Rachel, I'm sorry, but that apology came more than 30 years too late. Your biological father never knew you existed." The entire room fell silent after Rachel's mother spoke those words. Rachel stood frozen. No tears. No words. But her eyes looked like they had just lost the last thing keeping her standing. Her mother trembled as she slowly sat down. She held her own hands tightly, as if trying to hold together a past that had shattered long ago. Then she began to speak. 30 years ago, before she became the powerful Mrs. Morgan everyone knew today, she had loved a man with all her heart. No money, no status, just real love. And then she became pregnant with Rachel. But the Morgan family found out. They said that child would destroy the family's reputation. They forced her to marry Richard Morgan and cut off all contact with the man she truly loved. If it were you, would you choose the person you loved, or surrender to your family in order to protect the child not yet born? Tears slowly began falling from Rachel's eyes, because for the first time, she realized her mother had not simply stayed silent. She had lived for 30 years carrying guilt. But what truly sent a chill through Rachel's body was when her mother continued in a broken voice, "That man is still alive." Rachel froze. Her heart nearly stopped, because that meant, somewhere out there, there was still a man who never knew. He had a daughter for 30 years. Richard Morgan remained silent from beginning to end. No denial, no anger. He was no longer the powerful man who always controlled everything inside the Morgan family. Just a father, slowly falling apart. Rachel slowly turned to look at him. Her eyes were red with tears. "Dad, when did you find out?" The entire room stopped breathing. Richard lowered his head for a long time. Then, for the first time in years, he admitted the truth. "When you were 6, Rachel froze. Even Daniel could not believe it. For more than 20 years, Richard Morgan had lived with that secret, a secret powerful enough to destroy the family at any moment. He confessed that the day he discovered the truth, he almost lost his mind. He wanted to leave, to disappear from the family forever. Because every time he looked at Rachel, he was reminded of the deepest betrayal of his life. If it were you, Would you have enough compassion to raise a child who was not biologically yours for 30 years? Richard let out a bitter laugh, a laugh filled with hopelessness. But then, you called me Dad. For the first time. His voice began to break. And after that, I couldn't leave anymore. Rachel finally broke down crying, because for the first time, she understood that Richard had not only hurt her, he had been destroying himself for 30 years too. No one won in this secret. No one was truly happy. They were only broken people, trapped inside a lie that lasted an entire lifetime. Rachel collapsed onto the floor. She no longer had the strength to stand. For 30 years, she had lived believing she was never enough, not enough to be loved, not enough to be accepted, not enough to truly belong in the Morgan family. And now, she finally understood why. Not because she was weak, not because she had failed, but because everyone in that house had been living inside a secret too painful to face. Her mother broke down sobbing. Richard Morgan quietly turned his face away. Even Daniel, the one who had always stood beside Richard, could no longer keep himself together. If it were you, could you forgive a family that hid the truth about who you really were for 30 years? Rachel looked at each person standing before her. Then she smiled softly, a heartbreaking smile that made the entire room ache. So all this time, I never truly belonged here. Her mother immediately burst into tears. No, Rachel, don't say that. But Rachel only shook her head quietly, because the most painful part was not the DNA results. It was realizing she had spent her entire youth trying to earn love from a family that had already been broken long ago. Then Rachel slowly stood up. Her eyes were filled with tears, yet strangely calm. Maybe this is the first time our family has ever truly told the truth. And in that moment, everyone finally realized something. Painful truths do not always destroy people. Sometimes, they set them free from the lies that imprisoned them their entire lives. Eleanor knew the truth from the very beginning. The lawyer's words froze the entire room. Rachel slowly turned around. Her heart tightened. What do you mean? The lawyer carefully took out the final letter Eleanor had left behind before her death. The envelope was old, but the handwriting on the front was still clear. For Rachel, when you finally learn the truth about yourself. Rachel's hands began to tremble. She opened the letter, and the moment she read the very first line, tears instantly rolled down her face. Rachel, if you are reading this, it means you have finally learned that you do not carry the Morgan bloodline. The room fell completely silent. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. If it were you, how would you feel knowing that the one person who loved you unconditionally had carried that secret for years? Rachel kept reading. Eleanor wrote that Richard had once wanted to walk away from everything after discovering the truth. It was Eleanor who convinced him to stay, not for the family name, but for Rachel. She is innocent. Do not make her pay for the mistakes of adults. Rachel's mother burst into tears. Richard lowered his head in silence, because for 30 years, he had pretended he was fine, but he had never truly healed. Then Rachel reached the final line of the letter, and those words nearly shattered her world all over again. Your biological father never stopped searching for you and your mother. Rachel froze. The letter slipped from her hands, because that meant, somewhere out there, there was still a man who had loved her his entire life, but was never given the chance to call her his daughter. Rachel could barely breathe after finishing Eleanor's letter. The room fell into silence, a silence filled with tears. But this time, it was no longer the silence of manipulation or hidden secrets. It was the silence of people finally forced to face the truth. Rachel sat there for a long time. The letter still trembled softly in her hands. For 30 years, she had believed she was the most unwanted person in this family. But now she finally understood. Everyone had been suffering in their own way. Her mother had lived with guilt. Richard had lived with heartbreak and shattered pride. Daniel had grown up inside a family poisoned by secrets and twisted favoritism. And Rachel? She had grown up believing she would never be enough to deserve love. If it were you, could you still hold on to hatred after realizing they were all just people trying to survive a secret too painful to bear? Rachel slowly stood up. She looked at Richard Morgan, the man she had spent her entire life loving and resenting at the same time. Then she walked toward him. No one knew what she was about to do. Even Richard froze in shock. And then, Rachel hugged him. The entire room broke down in tears. Richard trembled. For the first time in many years, he cried like a real father. There was no Morgan group anymore. No power. No lies that had lasted for 30 years. Only a broken family, trying to learn how to heal each other from the beginning. Richard Morgan stood frozen as Rachel wrapped her arms around him. His hands trembled, as if for the past 30 years, he had never believed he still deserved forgiveness. No one in the room could hold back their tears anymore. Rachel's mother sobbed uncontrollably. Daniel turned his face away, because for the first time, the Morgan family was no longer hiding anything. No more power, no more reputation, no more perfect masks they had worn for decades. Only wounded people remained. Rachel slowly pulled back. Her tear-filled eyes met Richard's. "I used to think you hated me." Her voice broke. "But now I understand. You were just a man trapped inside pain for far too long." Richard broke down crying. A man who once terrified all of Morgan Group could no longer stop himself from crying in front of his daughter. "If it were you, would you have the courage to forgive the person who hurt you your entire life?" Rachel looked at her mother, then at Daniel, and finally, she understood something. That DNA secret had not only destroyed the Morgan family, it exposed every wound they had buried for 30 years. But somehow, that painful truth also saved them from continuing to live inside a lie. Then Rachel walked toward the window. The first light of morning slowly spilled into the room, and for the first time in many years, she no longer felt like an outsider. Not because of blood, but because finally, this family had begun learning how to love each other through the truth.